Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you all to Bhim Bhasya, my audio visual podcast series on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. This audio visual podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of this multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the grand vision that he had seen for our country. That is what this podcast series is all about. So let's proceed. Well, friends, in this episode today, episode 38, I'm going to talk about a surprisingly neglected facet of Dr. Ambedkar's multi-dimensional persona, and that is Dr. Ambedkar's role as a barrister at law. We all know that Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar was trained as a barrister in London and that he was the principal architect of the Indian Constitution. Yet, very few people are aware of the contribution of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar as a practicing lawyer and as a barrister. That is precisely what I'm going to talk about in this episode 38. Recent research reveals that Dr. Ambedkar was one of the earliest civil liberties lawyer, defending the freedom of speech, and he had a reputation of being a poor man's barrister. Let's take a look at the way Dr. Ambedkar's legal practice evolved. Dr. Ambedkar got his barrister's degree from Gray's Inn in London. It was in June 1922. On his return to India, in order to start his legal practice, he was registered at the Bombay High Court on the appellate side in June 1923. While Dr. Ambedkar was a lawyer politician, his case was entirely different from his most prominent lawyer politician contemporaries, such as Mahatma Gandhi, Jinnah, Motilal Nehru, and of course Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Dr. Ambedkar did not have the family network or the community network like Gandhiji or Jinnah or the Nehrus. That was a major constraint. As he confessed later in one of his speeches, he was humiliated as a Mahar barrister. Dr. Ambedkar could not afford an office near the High Court in South Mumbai. He had to set up his office at Damodar Hall in Parel, and that too with the help of contribution from his friends. Not surprisingly, it took months for Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar to get his first case. Nevertheless, he chose the legal profession. Researchers say that he did not get many cases in the 1920s and in the 1930s. As Dr. Ambedkar wrote 5 years later in his mouthpiece, Bahishkrit Bharat, he wrote this in February 1928. And I quote him, I knew there is no hope to gain from profession of legal practice as a lawyer because it depends on the touchable people. Dr. Ambedkar chose the legal practice as a career because it provided, as he said, liberty and free time to perform social work, unquote. Interestingly, and I find this amazing, Dr. Ambedkar declined the offer to be a district judge with a promise of promotion. as a High Court judge within 3 years. He also turned down a lucrative, highly lucrative offer by the Nizam of Hyderabad to become the Chief Justice of Hyderabad Princely State. Dr. Ambedkar did this in spite of the fact that his family finances were under severe threat. The reason was the same: liberty and free time to take up social work. This clearly shows yet again Dr. Ambedkar's deep commitment to the cause of the downtrodden. Recent research shows that Dr. Ambedkar handled four kinds of cases. First, those involving political activists. Two, those dealing with inter-community relations. Third, cases for the poor and needy clients. And fourth, those engaging with what he called the spirit of the Constitution. I would like to present a summary of selected 8 cases which were argued by Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar as a barrister. During the period 1926 to 1928, Dr. Ambedkar appeared in 2 very high-profile cases. First was for prominent members of the non-Brahmin movement, and second one was for a British communist who was one of the founders of the Communist Party of India. His case 1 is a famous case as a Deshatse Dushman case, enemies of the country case. What happened was, in 1924, the Pune municipality erected statues of Lokmanya Tilak and Krishna Shastri Chaplunker. In response, the activists of the non-Brahmin movement proposed erecting a statue of Mahatma Phule, which was strongly opposed by the Brahmin orthodoxy. In that tense atmosphere, a prominent activist from the non-Brahmin movement, Sri Keshav Rao Jedhe, he wrote a book which was published by another leading activist of the non-Brahmin movement called Zawarkar. And the book was titled Deshatse Dushman, which means enemies of the nation. The book vehemently criticized Lokmanya Tilak and Chaplunker, calling them foul names and arguing that they were not national heroes but rather enemies of the country. In September 1926, the city magistrate sentenced Zawarkar to a year in prison and Jedhe for 6 months. In October 26, Dr. Ambedkar appeared in the appeal on behalf of Jedhe and Zawarkar. After Dr. Ambedkar's strong technical defense, the High Court judge conceded that the attack was a mischievous one but not illegal one. And both Jedhe and Zawarkar were released from the prison. Dr. Ambedkar's this victory was seen as a symbolic win for the entire non-Brahmin movement. We now turn to the second case. And this is again very interesting case where appeal was made on behalf of one of the founders of the Communist Party of India. His name was Philip Spratt. He was the British communist and one of the founders of the CPI, as I said. He wrote a pamphlet called India and China, allegedly inciting hatred against the government of India. In 1927, when Philip Spratt arrived in Mumbai, he was immediately arrested for sedition. In the trial, Dr. Ambedkar assisted the main defense lawyer, which was Mr. F.S. Talyar Khan. Dr. Ambedkar assisted him as a junior. The defense argued that Spratt's pamphlet challenged British imperialism. It did not challenge the government of India. It also was argued that the older definition of sedition could not be reconciled with the Indian desires for self-government. And it was Barrister Jinnah who appeared in the bail application. Mr. Spratt was acquitted. This was seen as a victory for the entire lawyer community, giving them the freedom to be critical of the colonial government. What was at stake here was not merely Spratt's freedom, but the question of civil liberties under the British rule. Not surprisingly, there were celebrations all around. In fact, in one public meeting for celebration, Sarojini Naidu, close colleague of Mahatma Gandhi, she presided over. The third case that I'm going to talk about is the case about a forest satyagraha. In 1931, there was a forest satyagraha in Panvel, which is called Chirner Forest Satyagraha. An attempt was made by the British authorities to suppress that satyagraha. This led to riot, police firing, and several people died. 47 people were charged with robbery, murder, and unlawful assembly. Dr. Ambedkar defended the satyagrahis along with Congress party leaders K.M. Munshi and Baba Saheb Kher. Dr. Ambedkar's highly effective cross-examination of the prosecution witnesses led to a victory for the satyagrahis. These three cases demonstrated Dr. Ambedkar's skill as a lawyer barrister in securing freedoms within a repressive legal system and earned him respect as a lawyer across the entire political fraternity. Case 4. After the Saudar Lake Satyagraha in Mahad, 1927, which was led by Dr. Ambedkar himself, the so-called upper caste Hindus filed a court case arguing that the tank was a private property. As a defendant, Dr. Ambedkar successfully demonstrated that the tank belonged to the government and was not a private property. Dr. Ambedkar also thrashed the upper caste argument about the purity of the tank. He did that by producing evidence to the effect that a local Muslim butcher had been using the same tank. Dr. Ambedkar won at every level, from the local trial court to the Bombay High Court. From this particular trial emerged a powerful judgment that merely because the complainants could show a long-standing custom of excluding Dalits, it conferred no legal right upon the caste Hindus. This was the judgment given. Incidentally, a very distressing, very disturbing and distressing thing happened during that period. After a court case in Mahad, Dr. Ambedkar was returning to Mumbai in a car, and the car broke down on the way. It was raining heavily, and the car had broken down. So Dr. Ambedkar went to the nearby village to seek help. Can you believe such a great man? He was not even offered water to drink. So he was thirsty, he was hungry, he was fully drenched, and in that condition, Dr. Ambedkar had to spend the entire night under a tree. Next day morning, when he managed to return to his residence in Mumbai, he was so shocked that he locked himself in his home for 3 days. This incident had a permanent effect on Dr. Ambedkar's mindset. It demonstrated in such an ugly manner that no matter what level you reach in terms of your education or prestige or your status, you always remain an untouchable, no matter what. So this was a very sad, very distressful event that happened during his tenure as a practicing lawyer and a barrister. We now turn to case 5. During the 1930s, Dr. Ambedkar emerged as one of the main lawyers for the trade union leaders. In 1934, Dr. Ambedkar was involved in the defense of the leaders of the All India Textile Workers Conference. The trade unionists who were charged were almost all were communists. That included Comrade B.T. Randive, Comrade Maniben Kara, Comrade V.B. Karnik, and so on. The Trade Disputes Act of 1929, which Dr. Ambedkar had vehemently fought against in Mumbai Legislative Council, had allowed strikes, but for very limited purposes. Any strike that would inflict general and prolonged hardship was deemed to be illegal. As a defense lawyer, Dr. Ambedkar established at the cross-examination the argument that the textile strike would have caused a significant economic hardship to the community was invalid. He won the case. The trial court acquitted all the trade unionists, and the court accepted Dr. Ambedkar's contention that a pecuniary loss to the mill owners cannot be equated to hardship to the community. Dr. Ambedkar also successfully defended later Comrade B.T. Randive in Bombay High Court against sedition charges levied on him. We now turn to 6th case. This is again a very famous case. This is the case that was fought in 1934. It is very interesting to understand this case. In 1934, Dr. Ambedkar strongly defended Professor R.D. Karve's journal Samaj Swasthya on the charges of obscenity. Professor R.D. Karve, popularly known in Marathi literature as Raghunath Dhondo Karve. Professor R.D. Karve was son of famous social reformer Maharshi Karve, and Professor R.D. Karve had started India's first birth control clinic way back in 1921. And there was a Gujarati journal which was edited by Professor R.D. Karve and his wife. And that magazine, that journal, addressed the questions of sex and sexual hygiene. Clearly, Professor R.D. Karve was way ahead of his times. Dr. Ambedkar defended his case. Regrettably, he lost the case under the then prevailing law. However, it must be noted that Dr. Ambedkar's persuasive arguments led the High Court judge to concede that, and I quote, the taboo on silence on sexual matters should be ended, unquote. Interestingly, Dr. Ambedkar pursued the cause of birth control, and in 1938 he moved a bill in Bombay Provincial Vidhan Sabha advocating the use of modern techniques for birth control. And we have discussed that in one of our earlier episodes of Bhim Bhasya. We now turn to case 7. And this case is somewhat surprising. In 1938, Dr. Ambedkar somewhat surprisingly defended Chitpavan Brahman community. This is so-called Gore case. Normally, he was strongly opposed to them. In this case, Dr. Ambedkar fought on behalf of them to establish them as a distinct community. Dr. Ambedkar's motivation in fighting this case is not entirely clear, but one view is that Dr. Ambedkar's defense of the Chitpavan Brahmin community had strengthened his case for separateness of the untouchables from the caste Hindus, which was an important plank of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar's political strategy. As we have seen in the debates between Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Ambedkar during the roundtable conferences, this was a critical point in those debates, which took place between the years 1930 to 1932. And this case he fought 6 years later in 1938. During the 1940s and the early 1950s, Dr. Ambedkar was in Delhi, first as a member of the Viceroy's Executive Council during the years 1942 to 1946, then as a member of the Constituent Assembly from 1946 to 1950, and India's first law minister during the period 1947 to 1951, and of course, the principal architect of the Indian Constitution. Naturally, there were no legal cases. However, after resigning from the cabinet minister's post in September 1951, and while serving the nation as a member of Rajya Sabha, Dr. Ambedkar did fight a single case in 1952 before the Supreme Court involving constitutional law. What was this case about? This case was also a very unusual one. Dr. Ambedkar defended Maharaja of Kapurthala to challenge the constitutionality of the land reforms. Dr. Ambedkar lost the case because of a narrow textbookish interpretation of the Indian Constitution. However, Dr. Ambedkar succeeded in putting forth the case for identification of the spirit of the Constitution, unquote. And this argument about the spirit of the Indian Constitution continued to influence Supreme Court judgments time and again. In sum, even with a brief stint of legal practice, Dr. Ambedkar left an indelible print as a barrister on the working of the Indian judiciary. It is indeed very sad that very few people are aware of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar as a practicing lawyer and as a barrister. Well, friends, we can conclude our this session here. But before I leave, let me request you that if you like this podcast series, Bhim Bhasya, please like it, please share it, and please subscribe to it. So long until we meet again, real soon. Thank you. Namaskar.